Hey guys, Speed Biker 91 here. Today I'm going to be doing a talk. It might be a little bit more of a ramble really, but or a rant, whatever you want to call it. But I think it has to do with the cost of living versus the increase in wages in specifically Canada. I'm gonna just give you guys an example of what wages, let's say, used to be like versus what they are now, like the minimum wage, for example. I'll use that as an example, and I'll be talking about, just how much the cost of stuff has gone up. And it's not just inflation. That's what people don't realize. It's the cost of stuff has gone up way more than the actual inflation would be. What's very interesting is back, like for example, back in the late 70s when my mom was doing jobs, for example, in college, like part-time jobs, to pay for rent and all that stuff. But back then, the minimum wage was $2.65, and I know it. And she was basically telling me this one time that it's really crazy how good the minimum wage is versus before. It used to be $2.65 when I started, and I'm like, yeah, but how much was the cost of actual stuff? Because I actually went onto the Bank of Canada's website. And it's called like this, and they have like this inflation calculator thing. And what that does is it'll compare like what it would be to today's standards in terms of money value. $2.65 back in 1977 is actually a little bit more than the minimum wage today. It would be something like $11 or something like that, equivalent to that. And if you actually look at overall wages, like real wages, that living wages, people think, oh, $40,000 to $60,000 is a lot of money. $40,000 to $60,000 is a lot of money. It isn't really. It's not actually that much. The wages really, from what it seems like, they haven't actually gone up in like 30 years. Like seriously, because this was back in the late 70s, and like I say, minimum wage is actually the same. So that means that overall wages have not actually gone up, and that was in like 1977. Now, back in the early 80s, to give you guys that comparison, is if you actually look, for example, at prices of stuff, to give you an example, the cost of housing. I was reading an article the other day, and they were talking about oh, don't go. Yes, I was reading an article the other day, and they're talking about, just the cost that young people have to pay for things, considering too that we are obviously the lowest income bracket. We don't make usually that much more than minimum wage if you're under the age of 30 now. So you gotta take that into consideration. And he was basically talking about, this guy is basically talking about the cost of housing. Back in the early 80s when he finished college. And this guy actually, he got a job straight out of college, and he was actually able, this guy, I know, it's crazy, as crazy as it may seem, he's actually able to buy a house. And back then, in Toronto, to buy a house, it was, we're talking Toronto, not Mississauga, not the suburbs, we're talking Toronto. maybe not downtown, but in the city of Toronto itself. You could buy a house back then. The starting price was $80,000. All right. Now I put that into the inflation calculator. You know what it gave me? The inflation, and what the inflation calculator gave me was $200,000. All right, so that was the starting price for a house back then. Now, if you were to buy a house today in Toronto, like a beginning price house, it would be $700,000. So that means that it costs 6 times more now than it would if you were to just add in inflation. That is insane. That is insane. And it doesn't, of course, it doesn't just stop there. And I'm sure the cost of food as well has gone up relative to just, you know, inflation. And then insurance. I mean, when I was actually reading a forum on online, you know, from I think the forum's called GTA Motorcycle. The forum, and this guy in the forum was basically saying he lived in the Toronto area, and he said I think his insurance back, and this was in the early 90s, keep in mind, it wasn't that long ago. Insurance back then to insure, I think a 600 it was. He was 16 years old. He had 2 bikes, this guy, he was saying. To insure both his bikes, it was something like $400 a year for both bikes. Or for a seat, sorry. Yeah, $400 a year, something like that, for both bikes. Now, you take that into consideration today with the inflation calculator, something like $800. Now, what do I pay for this little bike here, this tiny 125? $200 a month, which is $2,400 a year. Insane. Absolutely fucking insane. Sorry for the language. Absolutely insane. So clearly, somebody is making a lot more money than the average worker is. That's what that tells me. And that prices are not actually reflective of wages. And that wages in reality haven't really gone up in the past 30 years. I'm not trying to be negative or anything, but, you know, I mean, it's really crazy when you look up the numbers. And I advise anyone to ask their parents who's been around in the 70s or 80s, you know, and go to the inflation calculator on the Bank of Canada's website and just add in the price of something back then compared to today, and you'd be pretty surprised. It's not just inflation that's making things go up. The prices have gone up way more than inflation actually has. So, anyways, thanks for tuning in, guys. I'm out.